Daniel 9:24. 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city. This prophecy is about Jerusalem, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. And look at that last line, to anoint the most holy. Just incredible. This prophecy takes us to the millennial reign of Christ. Also notice that the prophecy regards the holy city, Jerusalem. 70 weeks are determined for your people and your holy city. This prophecy is about Jerusalem, the city, not the temple itself. It is about the city of Jerusalem. Okay, so first, this is the 70 weeks prophecy. A week is a 7-year period. It is like a decade, a Jewish decade. Decades are 10 years. This one is 7 years. So a week is 7-year period. That's just something that we'll talk about later. But for now, be aware that 70 weeks means 70 7-year periods, or it's about 490 years. This prophecy goes over a long period of time, all the way to Christ. Let's read verses 25, 26, and 27. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublesome times. And after the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the Prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end of it shall be with a flood. Until the end of the war, desolations are determined. Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. Now, notice there are 3 time periods here. There is the 62 weeks, the 7 weeks, and the 1 week. These 3 time periods add up to 70, 62, 7, and 1. This adds up to the 70 weeks that Daniel's prophesying. Now, therefore, there are 3 prophecies within the 70 weeks. Each one of these time periods has its own prophecy, its own events, its own outcomes. There are gaps between the 62 and the 7, a large amount of time, a gap of 2,000 years between the 62 weeks and the 7 weeks. And then finally, the 1 week is the 7-year tribulation. So let's continue on and let's discuss the 62 weeks. Okay, so there are 3 little prophecies here, the 62 weeks, the 7 weeks, and the 1 week. They're independent prophecies, even though they have not been treated that way in the past. Okay, so the first prophecy is the 62 weeks. It happened first in time, and then the 7 week, and then the 1 week will happen in our future. That is the 7-year tribulation. 1 week is 7 years, so it's the 7-year tribulation. That's in our future, but right now let's look at the 62 weeks, which is well in our past. Now, look at verse 25. You will see that it deals with the 62 weeks, but it also deals with the 7 weeks. Both of those little prophecies are sort of merged in there, and we have to tease them out because there is information in there. And the information is, if you will notice, it says from the going forth of the command to restore and build, there are 2 commands. Until Messiah, Jesus, the Prince, AntiChrist, there are 2 people. And there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. There are 2 time periods. Why are there 2 of everything in this verse? Because there were 2 temple destructions. The first one happened in 586 BC in Daniel's time. And so he was taken into captivity, and he's there in captivity, and he's praying, I want to go home, I want to go home. And the angel says, I'm not going to just tell you when you're going home. I'm going to tell you about everything to do with Israel. So all the way to the Messiah, so a long future. So Daniel's temple was destroyed in 586, and a command went out to build Jerusalem back up again. And that command went out in the book of Nehemiah, 2nd chapter, and it happened in 445 BC. So that command to build happened in 445 BC. And then we start counting 62 weeks, which I'll show you in a minute. And when we get to the end of that time period, 62 weeks, we will hit Messiah. So it's this 62 weeks is about the build and the 62 weeks and then Messiah. The 7-week prophecy is also in this verse, and we'll deal with that in a minute. But first, let's look at the build, 62 weeks until Messiah. And let's count the years. What is 62 weeks? It's very simple. We'll do it right now. So how does God count years? Well, he counts by 7. So he goes 1 to 7, and he does that 7 times. So he literally gets 49 years out of that. And then he inserts a 50th year, a year of Jubilee. Jubilee is where the land reverts back to the original owner. It's not really important, but the important thing is that after 49 years, he inserts a 50th year of Jubilee. So he goes from 1 to 49, insert a year of Jubilee, 50. Then start over, 1 to 49, insert a year of Jubilee, 50. And he does, that's how he counts. Possibly he counted that way since the creation of the world. But for God, there is a 50th year of Jubilee after every 49. So we are going to count that way when we start counting our weeks. So we look at our 62 weeks prophecy. First of all, in 586 BC, Solomon's temple was destroyed, the first temple destruction. Then we're going to look at the 62 weeks now. So it begins with the 445 BC decree to rebuild the temple. Okay, so let's count 62 weeks. What is 62 weeks? Well, you know a week is 7 years. So first of all, we have 62 times 7, and that's 434 years. But also realize that in God's timeline, every 49 years, there is a year of Jubilee inserted. So this is more than 434 years because there are 8 years of Jubilee in this period. So 434 plus 8 years is 442 years. So this timeline is 442 years. And when we travel from that decree in 445 BC and we go forward 442 years, we arrive at 3 BC. Now, what happened in 3 BC? Well, the prophecy says we will arrive at Messiah. Messiah was born. Now, he wasn't born perhaps exactly in 3 BC, but he was born in the week, the 7-year period that had 3 BC in it. His birth was somewhere in that 7-year period. And that is exactly true because history knows that Jesus was born somewhere between 4 BC and even after maybe 1 AD. But most scholars think he was born around 3 BC, 2 BC, 1 BC. So this prophecy is quite accurate. We finished the 62-week prophecy with the birth of Messiah, and now we are going to enter into a gap period. There's a gap of time, a big gap of time between the birth of Christ and the beginning of the 7-week period. And in this gap, Daniel tells us what happens. So let's read verse 26. After the 62 weeks, notice he says after the 62 weeks, Messiah will be cut off. Messiah will be crucified. But not for himself. No, he's crucified for us. But notice that Daniel knows this. Daniel knows that Messiah will be killed. Now, Daniel continues that there are events after the crucifixion. So let's continue. The people of the prince who will come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Notice the city and the sanctuary, Jerusalem and the temple are destroyed. And notice that this happens after the crucifixion. This is all history now. In 70 AD, the Romans destroyed the temple of Jerusalem and the city and took the people into captivity, into slavery in Europe. And the people, most of the people were out of the city of Jerusalem. So who is this prince who will come? It's the people of the prince who will come, the people of AntiChrist. These are bad people, and AntiChrist is a bad person. Now, he's not on the scene here, but his sort of representative in the form of Caesar of Rome these are the people who destroy the city and the sanctuary. But notice Daniel's very specific. This prince is yet to come. And in fact, we will see that event happen. So now let's move to the 7-week prophecy. Now, as we count the 7 weeks, there's something you need to understand. The prophet Daniel was given a prophecy that said 70 weeks are determined for your people, Israel. The angel didn't say 490 years or 500 years. He didn't say 173,280 days. No, the prophecy was in weeks. Therefore, the most specific thing that we can conclude is that something will happen within a week. We can find the week, but we don't know what year or what day. As the Lord Jesus said, you don't know the day or the hour. And from this prophecy, you don't know the year either, but we can find the week and sort of give ourselves a range of years. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to get in that ballpark of the week. And let me show you an example with using a decade. Now, we all know that John Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. Now, suppose you're sitting in 1950 and an angel comes to tell you that the President of the United States will be assassinated in the next decade. So from where you're sitting in 1950, you know that there was only a 10-year span that this assassination can happen from 1960 to 1970, but you don't know the year. Also, from where you're sitting in 1950, you can know that the possibility of the president's assassination won't start for 10 years and it will end in 20 years. In other words, it could be 20 years before this assassination happens. So we're going to use these ideas to count the 7 weeks that lead and culminate in the presentation of AntiChrist. Now, we've already dealt with the 62 weeks. Now we're going to go back to verse 25, and we're going to deal with the 7 weeks. So remember that in this verse, all the information for the 62 weeks was in the verse, and all the information for the 7 weeks was in the verse. So I'm just going to skip over the information about the 62 weeks because we've done that, and I'm just going to talk about the 7 weeks. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore Jerusalem until the prince, Antichrist, there shall be 7 weeks. That is what we're going to talk about. Jerusalem, the temple, and the city were destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. And after 70 AD, way out in the future, way out 2,000 years later, a command went out to restore the city to the Jewish people, not to rebuild it, to restore it, to give it back to them, to the Jewish people. And there actually were 2 commands that have gone out. One happened when Donald Trump in 2017 said, Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. It could be that date, but I don't think it was the 2017 date. There was another event much prior to that event in 1967. In 1967, the Jewish army finally captured Mount Zion, the Temple Mount, and the eastern part of Jerusalem, putting Jerusalem in the hands of Israel for the first time in 2,000 years. This was the first time they were back in the land. And you see, this started the time clock again, because you see, this prophecy in full is about Israel and the people in possession of Jerusalem. It's about the holy city. And even before the 62 weeks, when that command went out, all those years, for that 400 and some odd years, Israel was in possession of Jerusalem. They weren't always in command because they were invaded by people, but they were always there and in possession of Jerusalem. And when Christ was born, that stopped the clock. And I think it stopped the clock because when Christ is on the earth, the clock is not running, whether it's from his first advent or after he returns the second time, the clock stops. In other words, we're not counting these 70 weeks anymore. So for 62 weeks, they held Jerusalem, and then Christ was born, clock stops, and for 2,000 years, they were out of the land. They were completely not in possession of Jerusalem, and it is about Jerusalem. So even though they came back to Israel in 1948, they still didn't have Jerusalem. But in 1967, they captured the eastern part of the city, which is Mount Zion and Jerusalem. Now, since that time, they have been in possession of Jerusalem. They have been in charge of Jerusalem, so to speak. And so we are going to count the period that they've been here since 1967, and we're going to start with that date, but we're going to count our 7 weeks, our 50 years. Remember, 7 weeks is 7 times 7, 49, plus 1 year of Jubilee, 50 years. So we are going to count and see where this takes us. Okay, let's do it. This gap period after the 62 weeks until the 7 weeks is super long, 2,000 years. So because in this gap period, the city of Jerusalem is out of the hands of the Jews, another command must go out to restore the city to the Jewish people and trigger the 7-week count. I believe this triggering event occurred in 1967. That is, we are going to use the 1967 date as the trigger to begin the 7-week countdown to the start of the tribulation. We are going to count the 7 weeks, which will end with the prince. In other words, this count will end with the first year of the tribulation period and the appearance of AntiChrist. It says, from the going forth of the command to restore Jerusalem, that command went out in 1967, to the prince, the Antichrist, shall be 7 weeks or 50 years, 49 years plus 1 year of Jubilee. So we are going to start our count at 1967 and count 50 years and arrive at the date of the tribulation period and Antichrist. This is the reason we are studying this prophecy, to determine the beginning 7 of the final tribulation period. Now realize that 1967 is still in the gap period. The clock doesn't start until the beginning of the 7 weeks. So let's do the count. 1967 starting, and then we count 50 years, and that takes us to 2017. Realize 2017 is a year of Jubilee. Every 50th year is a year of Jubilee. So therefore, the first year of the tribulation is 2018 by our calculation. Is that right? Well, possibly, but wait just a minute. Let's zoom in on this scene for a minute and see what happens. There's something we need to see before we draw any final conclusion. First, since 2017 is a year of Jubilee, because it occurs after the 49 years of the 7 weeks, then it stands to reason that the final year of our gap period, which we label 1967, that year must also be a year of Jubilee. That's because Jubilee years are 50 years apart. So definitely, the final year of the gap year is a year of Jubilee. But realize that 1967 is like any year. Every year sits in some 7-year decade. But we do not know where in the last 7 years of the gap 1967 sits. Suppose 1967 is not that last year before the count. Suppose 1967 is the first year of the final 7 years in the gap period. Then our count would look like this. 1967 to start with, 1968, 1969, 1970, 1971, 72, 1973, and the 7-year period would end, and then the year of Jubilee would be 1974. So at that point, we would begin our count of the 50 years to arrive at the next year of Jubilee, 2024. Thus, the first year of the tribulation would be 2025. Very interesting. So we have found that the first year of the tribulation could be as early as 2018, or it could be as late as 2025. Now, I highly doubt that it began before 2022, but possibly it began in 2023. Remember October 7th, 2023, when innocent Jewish citizens were slaughtered by Hamas, the atrocities, and Israel declared war on Hamas. So could the tribulation have begun in 2023? Or could it yet be coming in 2024 or 2025? How will we know? How will we know? What are we looking for? Well, the hallmark of the early tribulation is the signing of a peace treaty, Daniel 9:27. And he, AntiChrist, will confirm a covenant, a treaty, with many for 1 week or for 7 years. We are looking for a peace treaty. The Antichrist will be part of the signing of a major peace treaty. Now, most people teach that the peace treaty is a 7-year agreement, but instead consider that it is not a 7-year treaty that occurs at the beginning of the 7-year tribulation, but it is a peace treaty that occurs in the 7-year period, probably very close to the beginning. But it is possible that the October 7th slaughter and atrocities on the Israelis and the ensuing war might soon end with a peace agreement. And realize this peace treaty could be a global treaty that includes the Russians and the war in Ukraine, the settling of the conflict between Taiwan and China, an agreement to halt the conflict between Iran and the Saudis. Perhaps this famous peace treaty or covenant spoken of in Daniel 9:27 is the agreement that unites the beast, the one world government. Whatever the case, the agreement will be an unstable treaty that brings temporary peace. Certainly, the agreement will establish an international place of prayer on the Temple Mount, a place to accommodate all of the world religions, and perhaps a new Jewish temple will be built. Why do I say that? Well, look at the second part of Daniel 9:27. And in the midst of the week, he, Antichrist, shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. He will cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. This suggests that animal sacrifices will be taking place again. Sacrifices traditionally held on the Temple Mount at the temple site. But there is no Jewish temple at the moment. Instead, a Muslim mosque and the Dome of the Rock are the only edifices on the Temple Mount. So the Jewish temple has not been on that site since the Romans destroyed it in 70 AD. I'm not sure if the temple must be rebuilt, but know that the furniture and items for the temple are ready to populate a new building that could probably be erected in less than 1 year. So we are on the verge of something big. Anyway, we are looking for a peace treaty, and I personally am expecting a global international treaty that includes so-called solutions to the Israeli-Palestinian problem. So could the current war with Gaza be the issue that brings the parties again to the peace treaty table? You know, the final 7-year period feels imminent. The world is careening out of control. How much longer can these world events, alliances, and wars go on? We'll see. But the 7-year period could have already begun in 2023, or perhaps 2024 or 2025. We must wait and see. Perhaps you don't agree with this interpretation. I certainly acknowledge input from others, as they may disagree. However, I wanted to give you a heads up and go ahead and publish this model, this idea, because after these last few years, this prophecy could be coming to pass. And what I know about my father is that he has spoken in terms of weeks, 7-year periods, which this speaking of weeks gives him a range of years so that he can be long-suffering and still fulfill his prophecies. It is like our Father to wait as long as is prophetically possible. So the answer to whether or not to publicize this document was resolved in my mind. I decided I must give you a heads up and let you know what I think I know. And I know that we are all vigilant and waiting for his return. Of course, it will be a glorious return. I hope you will subscribe and join me as I continue studying the prophecies of Daniel from a more current viewpoint, for God is unsealing this information. Daniel is filled with the prophetic outline for our near future. These prophecies speak directly to our future. There is so much information that we must know, and the time is short.